All right, let's dive into one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries, the Zodiac Killer. We've got news articles and some background from Wikipedia. And we're not just looking at the straight facts, but we're really going to explore why this story still captivates us today, after all these years.
Yeah, what I think is so fascinating is that the Zodiac Killer wasn't just a criminal, right? He was a media manipulator. I mean, he was crafting his own legend through these cryptic messages and these terrifying threats.
It's like he wanted to make a horror movie, or a real-life horror movie. So to really understand how this unfolded, let's go back to where it began. December 20th, 1968, on Lake Herman Road.
Yeah, a secluded lover's lane just became a crime scene when two teenagers, David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, just 16, were shot and killed. And it was such a shocking start to what would become a terrifying series of crimes.
Witnesses, no real leads, just the stark realization that a killer was on the loose. Then on July 4th, 1969, the Zodiac struck again at another lover's lane in Blue Rock Springs Park. This time, 22-year-old Darlene Ferrin was killed, but her boyfriend, Mike McGough, survived.
Right, and McGough's survival was actually crucial because he was able to give the police a description of the attacker. He described him as a heavy-set white man, about 5'8", with a large face and curly light brown hair. But even with this info, the killer just remained elusive.
And then the case takes a really chilling turn. In August of '69, the Zodiac starts sending letters to local newspapers, claiming responsibility for the murders.
And these weren't just confessions, right? These were boasts. They were filled with chilling details that only the killer would know. And he even included threats of future violence if his letters weren't published, demanding they be printed on the front page. I mean, imagine the pressure those newspapers faced.
I can't even imagine being in that position, to run the risk of giving in to a killer's demands or possibly incite more violence. And then there were the ciphers. The Zodiac claimed these coded messages held the key to his identity.
Right, and the ciphers just became like a national obsession. People were trying to crack the code, hoping to unmask the killer. He was really playing this dangerous game, and the public was totally drawn into it.
Yeah, and he didn't disappoint when it came to more violence. On September 27, 1969, he attacked again at Lake Berryessa, stabbing Cecilia Shepard and Brian Hartnell. Cecilia tragically died from her injuries, but Brian survived. This attack, it really stands out because the Zodiac was actually seen wearing this bizarre costume. It was like an executioner's hood with sunglasses and a symbol on his chest.
Right, and adding to the terror of it all, he left a message on the car door, this chilling tally of his crimes. He even called the police from a payphone near the station to report the crime himself.
Talk about bold. The fact that he was able to blend in, to appear so normal while committing these heinous acts, that's what's so unsettling. Just a few weeks later, he struck again, shooting cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco. This time, he took a piece of Stein's shirt as a gruesome souvenir.
Yeah, and he mailed that piece of shirt to the San Francisco Chronicle, along with another letter, just adding to the growing terror. He even threatened to target school children next, raising the stakes even higher.
It seems like his crimes were escalating, becoming more brazen. Were the police any closer to catching him at this point?
They almost were. There were teenage witnesses who gave a description, and officers nearly caught him. But somehow, he always managed to just slip away.
It's just incredible how he managed to evade capture for so long.
What's so striking is how each of these crimes, while terrifying in their own right, built upon the last, solidifying this image of him as this almost mythical figure who's always one step ahead.
It's a chilling thought. So, these 5 attacks are what are officially attributed to the Zodiac. But there's a lot of debate about whether his reign of terror actually went far beyond these confirmed crimes.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more intriguing. Because when we start to look at possible Zodiac crimes, the body count, and the timeline, they really expand dramatically.
So we're talking potentially dozens of other victims. What makes investigators think these other cases could be connected to the Zodiac?
Well, there are some cases where the similarities are just really striking. Like take the 1963 Gaviota murders, for example. A young couple, Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards, were found shot to death on a beach.
Okay, so that kind of echoes the Lake Herman Road killings, both young couples, both in isolated locations. But is that enough to link them to the Zodiac?
Well, there are other details that make this case particularly compelling, like the fact that pre-cut lengths of rope were found at the scene, similar to what was used at Lake Berryessa. And ballistics testing suggested that the murder weapon was likely a .22 caliber rifle, the same type believed to have been used in that first Zodiac attack.
So a lot of unsettling parallels. What's the reason this case hasn't been officially linked to the Zodiac?
It really comes down to a lack of conclusive evidence. Remember, this was 1963, years before the Zodiac even surfaced as a suspect. There were no letters, no ciphers, no direct claims of responsibility. So while the similarities are definitely chilling, they remain circumstantial.
I see. So a possible connection, but not enough to close the case. What about the 1966 murder of Cherry Jo Bates in Riverside? That one's particularly brutal.
Yeah, this case is interesting because it introduces the possibility that the Zodiac was active even earlier than previously thought. Cherry Jo was a college student who was found stabbed to death near the campus library, and the brutality of the attack and the fact that her car had been tampered with. It all points to a level of rage and premeditation that really aligns with the Zodiac's MO.
Weren't there also some writings found that seemed connected to the Zodiac?
Right, months after the murder, the Riverside police received this handwritten letter titled The Confession, claiming responsibility for Cherry Jo's death. And the language and the tone were just eerily similar to the Zodiac's letters. And then there's the poem that was carved into a desk at the college library. Handwriting experts have actually suggested it could be a match to the Zodiac's writing.
So are we talking about a possible 6-year span of terror,
Yeah.
starting in 1963? That changes the whole timeline of the investigation. You mentioned earlier that there's some debate about the total number of victims. What's the range we're looking at?
Some estimates put the number as high as 49. But it's important to remember that these are just estimates based on potential connections and similarities to confirmed Zodiac crimes. There's no definitive proof linking him to all or even most of these cases.
Of those 49, are there any cases besides Gaviota and Cherry Jo Bates that really stand out?
You know, the 1970 disappearance of Donna Lass is often cited as a possible Zodiac victim. Donna was a nurse who vanished from State Line, Nevada. And what's particularly creepy about this case is that Paul Avery, the reporter who was heavily involved in covering the Zodiac case, received a postcard that seemed to reference Donna's disappearance. It was a collage of phrases, almost like a ransom note, and it was signed with a symbol that closely resembled the Zodiac's.
So even if he wasn't responsible for her disappearance, it seems like he was aware of it and maybe even using it to taunt those investigating him. Didn't new evidence come to light recently regarding Donna Lass?
Yeah, just last year, DNA testing confirmed that a skull found in the Sierra Nevada back in 1986 belonged to Donna Lass. Sadly, it confirms she was murdered, but it still doesn't directly point to the Zodiac.
So this confirms she was murdered, but it still doesn't point directly to the Zodiac. What are the chances this could be a copycat crime, or does this new evidence solidify the connection?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something investigators are surely looking into. The fact that her remains were found in a remote area and the timing of her disappearance align with the Zodiac's known activity, it definitely raises suspicions. But without any direct evidence linking him to the crime scene, it's impossible to say for sure. And that's the challenge with a lot of these possible Zodiac cases. We're dealing with decades-old evidence and often relying on circumstantial connections and interpretations of cryptic messages.
I'm struck by how these early letters really set the stage for this whole cat-and-mouse game that the Zodiac played with the media and the police. It seems like he was obsessed with controlling the narrative, with keeping everyone guessing.
Absolutely. He understood the power of the media, and he totally used it to his advantage. By sending letters to newspapers, by including ciphers and threats, he ensured that his name, his symbol, his crimes would remain in the public consciousness.
It's almost as if he wanted to be famous, even infamous. But it wasn't just the letters and the ciphers. He also made sure to leave behind physical evidence, those gruesome souvenirs like the piece of Paul Stein's shirt.
Exactly. He was meticulously crafting his own legend, leaving behind this trail of terror that continues to fascinate and horrify us to this day. It's like he wanted to ensure that even if he was never caught, his legacy of fear would live on.
So we've got this ever-expanding list of potential victims, these cryptic messages, and a killer who seems to vanish into thin air after each attack. It's like trying to catch a ghost. Where do investigators even begin to unravel this web of mystery?
Well, they start by looking at the evidence, however fragmented it may be. They try to connect the dots to see if any patterns emerge, to identify any potential suspects. And over the years, there have been thousands of leads, countless theories, and a handful of suspects who've garnered significant attention.
So let's dive into those suspects. Who are some of the most prominent figures who've been investigated over the years?
One name that always comes up is Arthur Lee Allen. He was a former school teacher and convicted sex offender who lived in Vallejo, near where the first two attacks took place.
So he was geographically close to the crimes, and he had a criminal record. What else made him a suspect?
Well, there were a number of things that put him on the radar. Witnesses claim to have seen him wearing a watch similar to one that the Zodiac was believed to have worn, and he owned a Royal typewriter, the same brand that was used to type some of the Zodiac's letters.
But was there any concrete evidence linking him to the crimes?
That's where things get tricky. Fingerprints taken from Alan didn't match those found at any of the crime scenes, and handwriting analysis of the Zodiac letters was inconclusive. He always maintained his innocence, and he was never formally charged.
So a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing definitive. And he died in 1992, taking his secrets, if he had any, to the grave. Were there any other suspects who seemed as promising or as suspicious as Alan?
There have been a few others who've garnered attention over the years. In 2014, a book was published claiming that Earl Van Best Jr. was the Zodiac. The author, Van Best's own son, based his theory largely on the physical resemblance between his father and the composite sketch of the Zodiac.
But were there any other details, any evidence beyond a physical resemblance that pointed to Van Best?
The book presented a number of circumstantial claims, including alleged connections between Van Best and some of the victims, as well as interpretations of the Zodiac's letters that the author believed pointed to his father. But like with Alan, there was no hard evidence, no DNA match, no smoking gun that definitively linked him to the crimes.
It seems like a lot of these theories hinge on circumstantial evidence and interpretations that could be subjective. Has there ever been a suspect with DNA evidence linking them to the crimes?
There has been one case in recent years that claimed to have DNA evidence. A group of independent investigators known as the Case Breakers announced in 2021 that they believed Gary Francis Post, an Air Force veteran who died in 2018, was the Zodiac. They claimed to have DNA evidence linking him to one of the crime scenes.
So did that finally crack the case wide open?
Not quite. Law enforcement has been skeptical of their findings. The DNA evidence they presented wasn't a perfect match, and it wasn't enough to convince authorities to officially name Post as the Zodiac. Plus, Post's family has maintained his innocence, and some witnesses who knew him dispute the physical description provided by the Case Breakers.
It's frustrating that even with advances in DNA technology, we still haven't been able to definitively solve this case. It all seems to come back to that lack of a clear, irrefutable link.
Exactly. The Zodiac was incredibly careful. He wore gloves, he avoided leaving fingerprints, and he seemed to have a knack for disappearing without a trace. And even with the cracking of one of his ciphers back in 2020, known as the Z340, we're still no closer to knowing his true identity.
Wait, the Z340 was cracked? I thought that was one of the codes that had stumped investigators for decades.
Yeah, it was, for over 50 years. But a team of code breakers finally managed to decipher it in 2020. Unfortunately, it didn't reveal the Zodiac's name or any groundbreaking clues. It was more of a rambling, misspelled message, full of egotistical boasts and threats, but with no real substance that could help identify him.
So another piece of the puzzle, but not the missing piece that everyone was hoping for. It makes you wonder, why, after all these years, are we still so captivated by this case? What is it about the Zodiac that continues to fascinate and terrify us?
I think it's a combination of factors. On one hand, there's the pure mystery of it all. We love a good puzzle, and the Zodiac case is the ultimate unsolved puzzle. He left us with so many questions, so many tantalizing clues, and yet the answers just remain elusive.
It's like that itch you can't scratch.
Exactly. And then there's the fear factor. The Zodiac represented this kind of boogeyman, this shadowy figure who could strike anywhere, anytime. He targeted everyday people, which made his crimes all the more terrifying. He tapped into our primal fears about the randomness of violence, the idea that evil could just lurk in the most ordinary places.
And he seemed to relish in that fear and the notoriety he was gaining. It's like he wanted to become a legend, a real-life horror movie villain.
And in a way, he succeeded. The Zodiac's image, his symbol, his cryptic messages, they've become ingrained in our pop culture. He's inspired countless books, movies, documentaries, and even a few copycat crimes. He's become this cautionary tale, this symbol of the darkness that can hide beneath the surface of normalcy.
It's a chilling thought that someone capable of such horrific acts could blend in so seamlessly. Could be our neighbor, our coworker, someone we pass on the street without a second thought.
It's a reminder that we never truly know what lurks beneath the surface, what secrets people may be hiding. And that unsettling truth is a big part of why the Zodiac case continues to haunt us.
So, despite all the theories, all the investigations, all the attempts to crack the code, the central question remains unanswered. Who was the Zodiac?
That's the question that continues to drive us, to fascinate us, to keep us searching for answers. We want to believe that there's an explanation, a reason, a way to make sense of the chaos he left behind. But maybe that's the ultimate lesson of the Zodiac case. that sometimes there are no easy answers, no satisfying resolutions. Sometimes the mystery endures and the darkness lingers.
It's unsettling to think that even with all of our advancements in forensic science and technology, there are still mysteries that may never be solved.
Yeah, it's a humbling reminder that we don't always have control, And I think that's another reason why this case resonates so strongly with people. It taps into this deep-seated anxiety about the unknown, the things that we just can't explain or control.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of helplessness that comes with a case like this. We want justice for the victims, we want answers, but it feels like we're always just one step behind.
Yeah, and that feeling of helplessness is only amplified by the fact that the Zodiac deliberately toyed with the public and law enforcement. He sent those taunting letters, those cryptic messages, and he seemed to just revel in the fear and frustration that he was causing.
It's almost like he wanted to prove that he was smarter, more cunning than everyone else. And that need for control, that desire to manipulate, it speaks to a very specific type of personality, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting from a psychological standpoint, right? We can speculate about his motives, his personality, his possible background, but without knowing his true identity, it's all just informed guesswork.
So, even if we never unmask the man behind the Zodiac, can we still learn something from this case?
I think we can learn a lot. The Zodiac case forced law enforcement to adapt, to develop new investigative techniques, to rethink how they approach complex, high-profile cases. It also spurred advancements in forensic science, particularly in the field of DNA analysis.
It's a bittersweet realization that those advancements, those lessons learned, came at such a high cost. The victims and their families paid the ultimate price for those advancements.
Yeah, and let's not forget about the lasting impact on the survivors. Living through an attack like that, being targeted by someone like the Zodiac, it leaves an indelible mark. The trauma, the fear, the constant looking over your shoulder that never truly goes away.
It makes you realize that even if the Zodiac is gone, his shadow still looms large. His actions continue to affect people's lives even decades later.
And that kind of brings us back to the question we started with. Why does this case, even after all these years, still grip our imaginations?
I think it's because the Zodiac case represents more than just a series of unsolved crimes, right? It's a story about our fears, our fascination with the unknown, and our need to make sense of the seemingly senseless.
It's a reminder that even in a world where we're constantly bombarded with information, where technology seemingly has an answer for everything, there are still mysteries that elude us. There are still stories that just remain unfinished.
So maybe the real question isn't who is the Zodiac? Maybe it's what does our enduring fascination with this case tell us about ourselves?
Now that is a question worth pondering. What do you think? What aspect of this deep dive stood out to you the most? What would you focus on if you were investigating this case?
For me, it's the ciphers. The idea that these coded messages might hold the key to unlocking the mystery, it's just so tantalizing. And even though the Z340 didn't reveal his identity, it still gives us a glimpse into his mindset, his twisted sense of humor, his need to control the narrative.
Yeah, that's a great point. The ciphers are like a direct line to the Zodiac's thoughts.
Yeah.
Even if they're often nonsensical and frustrating, they offer this window into the mind of a killer, and that's both fascinating and terrifying.
Well, we've explored the chilling facts of the case, delved into the possible victims and suspects, and even tried to unravel the psychology of the Zodiac himself. But as with most enduring mysteries, we're left with more questions than answers.
But maybe that's okay. Maybe the mystery is part of what keeps this story alive, what keeps us coming back to it, trying to piece together the fragments, searching for that elusive truth.
And who knows, maybe one day someone will uncover that missing piece of the puzzle, that crucial clue that finally solves the mystery of the Zodiac Killer. Until then, the case remains open, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the shadows.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries. We encourage you to explore further. Check out the show notes for links to some of the sources we discussed, as well as additional resources for those who want to delve deeper into the case.
And if you're fascinated by true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the stories that continue to haunt us, be sure to subscribe and join us next time for another deep dive. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and maybe, just maybe, keep that light on a little longer tonight.